Welcome to Astral Time Walker, a history sleep story channel designed to help you relax, unwind, and fall asleep while drifting gently through the past. In this video, you will be calmly guided through a third-person retelling of a Venetian glassmaker's simple life during the Renaissance. The narration will slowly fade into a soothing, auditory ambience aimed to gently put you to sleep. Turn your brightness low, your volume at a comfortable level, and your mind to rest. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The Lagoon Awakes. The world returned not with a sound, but with a scent. It was the fragrance of damp stone, ancient and cool, mingling with a distant, saline breath carried on the gentlest of pre-dawn breezes. Before the eyes opened, the nose knew the place, the waterlogged city, the silent lagoon. Then came the sound, the soft, persistent lap, lap, lap of canal water kissing the moss-slicked mooring post directly below the shuttered window. It was a rhythm as old as the tides, a liquid heartbeat that had coaxed the sleeper from dreams of molten light and crystalline forms. Eyes opened to a room still held in the grasp of soft gloom. The high ceiling was lost in shadow, the whitewashed walls a pale grey canvas. From the narrow bed, the view was of the window's wooden shutters, between whose slivers a faint pearlescent light hinted at the world outside. Throwing off the thin wool blanket, bare feet met the terrazzo floor. The chill of the polished stone was a sharp, welcome shock, a grounding touch that swept away the final cobwebs of sleep. The floor's geometric patterns of marble chips were smooth and familiar underfoot. A map walked every morning. Crossing the small room, fingers found the iron latch of the shutters and released it with a soft click. Pushing them outward, the cool air of the canal washed in, rich and full. The view was a slice of Venetian intimacy, the green-black water of the narrow Rio, the opposing wall of ochre plaster stained by centuries of damp and salt, a single wooden boat, a sandalo tethered to the post below. The sky was a vast, washed-out dome of lavender, and the palest gold, the colour of a dove's breast. In the east, over the tiled rooftops and crooked chimneys, a band of light was slowly intensifying, promising not glare, but a gradual, gilded suffusion. The ritual of the morning was a quiet ballet of simplicity. From a small cupboard came a round loaf of yesterday's bread, its crust hard. A knife scored it, and the pieces were placed on a terracotta plate. A ceramic cruet yielded a stream of golden green olive oil, which pooled in the bread's porous heart. A pinch of coarse salt from a seashell completed the preparation. This was breakfast, its austerity, a kind of reverence, a clearing of the palate for the day's more vivid sensations. Carrying the plate to the doorway that led directly onto the water-level fondamenta, the craftsman sat on the worn stone step. The canal was a mirror, slowly coming to life. The first direct rays of the sun, finding their path between the high buildings, touched the water's surface not with a blaze, but with a delicate, trembling gilding. It was as if a master gilder was at work, tipping each tiny wavelet with liquid gold. The light climbed the opposite wall, transforming the ochre into a warm, honeyed glow, revealing the texture of the plaster, the ghostly outlines of frescoes, long faded. As the bread was eaten, the senses catalogued the waking city. A distant clatter from a kitchen somewhere, the cry of a gull wheeling high above, the soft thump of a shutter opening further down the Rio. The oil was fruity and peppery on the tongue, the bread's staleness softened by it into something substantial and good. This was the calm centre, the still point before the day's fire. Finishing the simple meal, the gaze turned left, to the low-arched doorway a few steps along the fondamenta. That was the workshop. From it, even now, emanated a faint, dry warmth. The residual breath of yesterday's furnace, a sleeping giant of brick and iron. The anticipation of rekindling that heart was a quiet, physical pull in the chest, a longing for the transformative heat, for the weight of the blowpipe, for the mesmerizing dance of molten glass. It was the anticipation of the void, the empty crucible soon to be filled with a glowing, honey-thick pool of potential from which anything might be born. A delicate goblet, a sturdy bottle, a bowl to catch the very light now dancing on the water. Rising, the plate was collected. The sun was higher now, the gilding on the canal turning to a brighter, more diffuse shimmer. The shadows were shrinking, sharpening the lines of the world. Back inside, the few morning tasks were completed with efficient hands, the bed smoothed, the wash basin used, the simple tunic and leather apron donned. The terrazzo floor, now streaked with sunlight from the window, no longer felt cold. It felt like a launch pad. The final act was to run a hand over the tools laid out on a side table. The wooden paddles, the shears, the pontal iron, their shapes as familiar as the lines of one's own palm. Then, with a last deep breath of the brine and stone-scented air, the craftsman turned towards the arched door, towards the waiting dark of the workshop, and the promise of the fire within. Chapter 2: The Fire's Heart, Part 1. The workshop door, a thick slab of oak darkened by smoke and time, swung inward on iron hinges that groaned a low familiar protest. The world shifted instantly. The fresh watery light of the canal was swallowed by a profound warm gloom, a darkness that was not empty but thick with memory and latent energy. The air itself had weight and taste here, a dry mineral scent of old ash, baked brick, and the faint, sharp ghost of yesterday's molten silica. It was the breath of a slumbering beast, and crossing the threshold was an entry into its den. Residual heat enveloped the body like a comforting embrace, a blanket woven from yesterday's labour. It emanated from the great brick mass of the furnace, which dominated the far wall, a silent altar. Its iron door was sealed, but warmth radiated from its flanks, palpable against the skin. The terrazzo floor here was gritty underfoot, dusted with a fine grey powder of ash and sand that whispered with each step. High above, narrow windows set near the ceiling allowed slants of the new morning light to cut through the smoky dimness, illuminating drifting motes that danced like slow gold dust. The first ritual was one of resurrection. Approaching the furnace, the iron door handle was cool, despite the ambient warmth. Pulling it open revealed the cavernous maw within, a landscape of greying embers and deep feathery ash that glowed with a faint pulsating heart of orange deep within its drifts. The sight was one of profound potential, a banked fire holding the seed of transformation. Using a long flat iron rake, the ashes were carefully banked to the sides, consolidating the remaining heat. Then from a stacked pile of seasoned beechwood, split logs were fed into the chamber. They settled onto the embers with soft thuds, pale bark stark against the grey. For long minutes nothing happened. Then a tendril of smoke curled, a lick of flame found purchase, and a low, hungry crackle began to build within the brick vault. The coaxing was gentle, patient, a nurturing of the flame until it grew confident, spreading its warmth through the refractory bricks, beginning its long task of heating the massive clay crucible nestled inside to a temperature that would turn sand into liquid light. With the fire's revival assured, attention turned to the tools. They lay on a long, scarred wooden bench, arranged with a precision that bordered on devotion. The hands moved over them, not merely picking them up, but reacquainting. The blowpipe, a 6-foot length of hollow iron, was lifted first. Its weight was substantial, demanding, a promise of the burden to come. The smooth-worn wood of the handle fitted perfectly against the calloused palm. Next, the marva, a solid, polished slab of smooth dark marble, cool and implacable. A thumb stroked its flawless surface, the plane upon which chaos would first be given order. Then the jacks, their long scissor-like arms and blunt pincer ends. Their touch was one of delicate control, of precise intention. Each tool's heft was a word in a silent language, their collective presence a sentence stating readiness. The furnace's mutter grew to a steady roar, a sound felt in the bones as much as heard. Peering through the glory hole, the interior was a vision of infernal beauty. The flames danced and swirled, a contained storm of yellow and white, and there, in the centre, sat the crucible. Within it, the gathered batch of silica, soda and lime, once a mere mixture of powders, had begun its metamorphosis. It was now a seething, viscous pool, the colour of thick golden honey, its surface shimmering with heat waves that distorted the firelight behind it. It was alive, this molten glass, bubbling slowly, a captured sun. Selecting the blowpipe, the end was thrust into a side chamber of the furnace to heat, rotating it slowly to ensure an even warmth. A cold pipe would shock the gather, invite flaws. When the iron glowed a dull cherry red, it was withdrawn. The movement towards the crucible was a slow, deliberate arc. The pipe was angled, then dipped into the radiant pool. A turn of the wrist, a slow rotation, and the molten glass adhered to the tip. A glowing, syrupy gather. The first lift was a test of strength and timing. Too fast and the strand would break. Too slow and it would drip. With a steady, firm pull, the pipe was raised, a glowing orb of liquid light, the size of a large apple, clinging to its end. The initial resistance was profound. The mass was a heavy, molten planet, dragging downward with a relentless, fluid gravity. The shoulders braced, the arms engaged, and the pipe began to turn, a constant, even rotation to prevent the gather from sagging or becoming misshapen. The heat from it was a solid force, bathing the face in a wave that dried the eyes and tightened the skin. Then, as the rotation continued and the glass began to cool from its outermost skin, inward a change occurred. The resistance softened, the dreadful weight integrating with the motion. The molten core flowed within a more stable, viscous shell. The material's memory of solidity was forgotten, replaced by a fluid grace. It was no longer a burden merely to be held, but a partner in a nascent dance. The glowing sphere at the pipe's end pulsed with an inner light, its surface a perfect meniscus curve of orange gold, obedient now to the rhythm of the turn and the will of the hands that held it. This was the moment of capture, the first fragile communion between fire, earth, and intent, a single point of molten potential suspended between the furnace's heart and the waiting, patient air of the workshop. Chapter 2, The Fire's Heart, Part 2. The dance began not with a step, but with a breath, bringing the blowpipe to the lips, the lungs filled with the workshop's hot, dry air, and then a steady, controlled stream was exhaled into the hollow iron tube. The breath travelled down its length, a soft, invisible pressure pushing against the molten gather, clinging to the far end. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then deep within the glowing orb's golden heart, a miracle occurred. A bubble, a tiny cavity of air, swelled into being. It was a genesis, the creation of an interior world, a hollow potential around which all further form would coalesce. The rotation of the pipe never ceased. a constant hypnotic spin that kept the gather symmetrical. As the breath continued, gentle and persistent, and the bubble grew. The glass expanded, thinning from a solid globe into a luminous, pulsating bladder, its walls stretching, glowing brighter as they became more delicate, a fragile embryo of a vessel. The heat bled away quickly into the cooler air. The glass's surface lost its liquid shimmer, taking on a stiff, taffy-like consistency. This was the moment for the marver. The glowing, bulbous mass was rolled across the polished slab of dark marble. The contact produced a hiss, a whisper of steam, and the glass obeyed the stone's unyielding flatness. The irregular surface smoothed, the shape compressed and regularized into a more uniform cylinder. The marver did not shape so much as it defined, imposing the first law of geometry upon the molten chaos. The glass, now imprinted with the stone's cool intelligence, was lifted, its heat already fading to a deeper, cherry red. It had to return to the fire. Back into the mouth of the furnace it went, the gather thrust into the roaring yellow-white heart. The glass drank the heat greedily, its stiffened shell softening, glowing once more with that inner, vital light. Withdrawn again, it was time for colour. On the bench lay the prepared canes, thin rods of glass, each a solid core of brilliant hue, a deep cobalt blue, a vibrant emerald green, a rich ruby red. Selecting a blue cane, its cool tip was touched to the glowing, rotating gather. The contact was delicate, a kiss of colour. The clear, hot glass welcomed it. The coloured rod began to melt, not dripping, but flowing into the gather's surface, adhering in a stripe that wrapped around the rotating form like a ribbon. Another cane, this time green, was applied, then another of red. The colours melted and merged at the edges, their individual identities softening into bands of stunning clarity that spiralled around the expanding form. They were not painted on, they were swallowed and integrated, becoming part of the glass's very substance. Their vibrancy trapped within the crystal matrix, promises of brilliance to be revealed only when the piece cooled to transparency. Reheating was a constant refrain. The glass shuttled between the furnace's transformative roar and the still, intent air of the workshop, each journey a cycle of softening and shaping. With the coloured stripes now fluid and seamless, the wooden blocks were taken up. These were simple tools, pads of soaked hard wood held in each hand. The glowing mass was rolled between them, the damp wood hissing and steaming, the gentle compressive pressure guiding the form. This was where the vision in the mind began to transfer to the material in the hands. The wooden blocks cupped and coaxed. The bubble within, still connected to the breath in the lungs, provided a gentle resistance. Between the push of the air and the pull of the tools, a curve began to emerge. It was the suggestion of a belly, the gentle swell of a bowl. The hands felt it through the tools, a yielding, a compliance, as the glass remembered the shape being asked of it. The curve deepened, softened. The wooden pads smoothed the imperfections, blending colour into clear glass, defining the nascent vessel's profile against the dim workshop light. The process was a physical conversation. The heat was the glass's voice, growing faint and stubborn, demanding a return to the fire to speak again. The hands and breath were the replies, asking for curvature, for thinness, for grace. Each reheating was a punctuation, each shaping with the blocks a sentence in the dialogue. The form became clearer, more specific. The once amorphous gather now possessed a foot, a rounded base that would allow it to stand. Its walls, once thick and clumsy, were thinned by the constant rotation and the gentle internal pressure, becoming elegant and even. The coloured canes, now fully integrated, spiralled in a lazy, beautiful helix from the base toward the open top, their patterns stretched and refined by the expansion, like captured smoke. Finally, the shape was nearly complete. A deep, generous bowl, its sides a perfect, continuous curve, from the solid base to the subtly flared lip. It glowed with a deep, rosy heat, the colours within mere dark suggestions against the radiant matrix. The ache in the shoulders was a steady burn, the forehead beaded with sweat that evaporated instantly in the furnace's ambient heat. The focus was absolute, a tunnel vision that contained only the turning pipe, the glowing form, and the next minute adjustment of the wooden blocks. The bowl was not yet finished. It still clung to the blowpipe, its top sealed around the iron. But its essential spirit was present, captured in the curve that swelled like a breath held in contentment, in the smooth arc that reflected not just firelight, but the intention of the hands that had drawn it from the fire's heart. It hovered there, a vision half-born, a promise of cool blue and green and red waiting beneath the heat haze, a vessel that had, through 100 tiny corrections and reheats, chosen to become exactly this. Chapter 3. The Master's Nod. The bowl had reached its final glowing state, a perfect, radiant curve suspended at the end of the iron pipe, when the presence was felt. It was not a sound, for the maestro moved through the workshop with the silent grace of a deep-sea current. It was a shift in the air, a subtle thickening of the atmosphere near the bench, a cooling of the heat on one side of the body as his figure intercepted the warmth radiating from the furnace. He had entered without announcement, a spectre of quiet authority, and now stood a few paces away, a still column in the dance of fire and motion. His observation was a physical weight, the craftsman's focus, which had been a laser beam trained on the turning glass, now split, a portion of attention siphoned toward that silent, watching form. The maestro's hands were clasped behind his back, his posture erect yet relaxed, his face an impassive mask, carved from seasoned oak and lit by the furnace's flickering glow. His eyes, however, were alive. They were the colour of the lagoon under a winter sky, a pale, penetrating grey, and they did not blink as they travelled the lines of the glowing bowl. They traced the contour from the solid, rounded base up the swelling belly to the delicate, flared lip. They followed the spiral of coloured canes, the cobalt, the emerald, the ruby, now stretched into elegant, fluid bands within the semi-molten matrix. His gaze was a measuring tool, calipers and straight-edge-made flesh, assessing the symmetry, the evenness of the wall, the integration of the colour. Under that scrutiny, every minor imperfection seemed to magnify, a slight unevenness in the curve near the base, a place where the green cane had blurred a fraction more than intended. The heat of the furnace felt suddenly oppressive, the weight of the blowpipe more burdensome. The rotation, however, never faltered. It was a point of pride, a discipline drilled over countless mornings to maintain the rhythm even under the master's eye. The bowl continued its slow, hypnotic turn, presenting every angle to his judgment. For a long minute, there was only the roar of the fire and the soft hiss of the glass cooling. The maestro's expression gave nothing away. Then his head tilted just a degree. His eyes narrowed infinitesimally, focusing on the junction where the bowl's foot met its body. The craftsman's heart, already labouring from the heat and effort, seemed to stutter. That was the tricky transition, the place where weakness could hide, where a poorly managed temperature could cause a stress point that would later scream into a crack. Then it happened, a single slow vertical motion. The maestro's chin dipped toward his chest and rose again, a nod so deliberate it seemed to occupy its own expanse of time. It was not a gesture of exuberance or congratulation. It was an acknowledgement, a silent verdict of sufficient. It was the sealing of a contract between the vision and the execution. The warmth that spread through the craftsman's chest then was a distinct, profound sensation, entirely separate from the furnace's dry blast. It was a liquid glow, a flush of validation that started behind the sternum and radiated outward, easing the ache in the shoulders, steadying the hands on the pipe. It was a reward more potent than any praise, for it was earned in silence and understood in full. The moment passed. The bowl was cooling past the point of shaping, its surface dimming from bright cherry to a deep, matte blood red. The practical ritual of completion took over. With careful steps, the blowpipe and its attached piece were carried across the gritty floor to the annealing oven, a large insulated kiln set at a far cooler wall. Its heavy door was swung open, revealing a dark cavernous interior, maintained at a precise, gentle heat. Using a pair of long metal tweezers, the craftsman deftly tapped the junction where the glass met the pipe. With a soft tink, the bowl released, its open lip now a perfect circle. It was caught on a broad, flat paddle and gently slid onto a bed of warm ash inside the oven, where it would rest for many hours, cooling slowly, gradually, its molecular structure relaxing into stability, its tensions soothed away. A rapid cool would doom it to shatter. This slow surrender was an act of preservation, a patient midwifery. The oven door closed with a soft final thud. The immediate connection to the piece was severed. The blowpipe, now tipped with a cold, jagged remnant of glass, the pontil mark, was set aside to cool. The world, which had narrowed to the glowing sphere and the master's gaze, now rushed back in. The workshop's heat was suddenly felt as exhaustion. A clean, rough cloth was lifted from the bench, and the craftsman wiped his brow, the linen coming away damp with honest sweat. The smell was sharp, human, a tang of salt and effort that cut through the workshop's dominant sense of mineral, ash and heat. It mingled with the air, an honest testament to the morning's labour. The tools on the bench lay still, their work done for now. The furnace roared on, indifferent, already holding the potential for the next gather, the next shape. But for this moment, there was only the lingering warmth in the chest, the memory of that slow nod, and the quiet knowledge that inside the annealing oven, a bowl was settling into its permanent form, carrying within its curves and coloured bands the silent approval of the lagoon's grey eyes. Chapter 4. The Noon Bell. The sound began as a vibration in the stones. A deep, resonant hum felt through the soles of the feet before it reached the ears. It was the great bell of San Giovanni, a mile distant across the tiled rooftops, its bronze tongue striking the solemn hour of 12. The single profound note hung in the hot, still air of the workshop, a wave of sound that seemed to push against the furnace's roar and win, imposing a moment of temporal order upon the timeless dance of fire and glass. It was a release, a permission granted. The shoulders, which had been held in a permanent state of tensioned readiness, slumped a fraction. The hands, gripping a pair of shears, stilled. The bell's peal was not an interruption, but a conclusion, drawing a clean line beneath the morning's labour. The ritual of disengagement was as precise as that of creation. The tools were laid upon the bench in their designated places, the blowpipe racked, the wooden blocks returned to their water bath. The furnace, its heart a roaring yellow inferno, would be tended by an apprentice through the siesta, bank to hold its fierce temperature for the afternoon's work. For now, the craftsman's part was done. Turning to a corner of the workshop, a bucket of water drawn that morning from the cistern awaited. It was no longer cool, but it was a world away from the furnace's blistering dryness. Plunging hands into it was a shock of relief. The water was clear, but as the fingers scrubbed with a lump of coarse soap, it clouded instantly. Swirls of grey and black erupted, charcoal dust from handling fuel, fine ash from the air, the stubborn grime of sweat and effort. The suds turned murky, a miniature lagoon of filth. Watching the dirt slough away, swirling in abstract patterns before settling, felt like shedding a skin, the literal grime of transformation washing down the drain in the floor, returning to the earth. Drying hands on a clean linen towel, the craftsman stepped out of the workshop's dark, mineral-scented embrace and into the canal-side lane. The contrast was so violent, it was almost physical, a blow of light and air. The narrow Carl was a canyon of brightness, the white midday sun hammering down onto the worn stone pavement, reflecting off the pale plaster of the buildings with a blinding intensity. The shadows were not soft but carved, sharp and black as ink, lying in perfect geometric strips beneath window ledges and the few protruding roof eaves. The heat here was different, not the dry, radiating oven heat of the workshop, but a moist, heavy warmth that lay on the skin like a damp cloth, carrying the complex perfume of the city. Wet stone, drying seaweed, fried food, and the faint, ever-present, underlying decay of brine and silt. Joining the quiet flow of humanity was like entering a slow-moving stream. Other artisans emerged from similar low doorways, a carpenter with sawdust in his hair, a stonecutter with pale dust coating his arms like gloves. Their faces shared a common expression of weary satisfaction, eyes squinted against the glare. No words were exchanged. There was only the soft scuff of leather soles on stone, the collective exhalation of a morning's work released. The stream trickled toward the mouth of the Kali, where it spilled out into the broader expanse of a campo, a sun-drenched square mercifully open to the sky. The campo was a stage for midday respite. On its far side, a small church facade glowed in the sun, its marble saints watching over the scene with blank, benevolent eyes. But the immediate focus was the water. A narrow canal fed into the square's edge, and there, bobbing gently on the green water, was a flat-bottomed boat, a bragotto. Its sole occupant, a wiry man, with a face like tanned leather, tended a small charcoal brazier set amidships. Upon it, whole fish, scombri mackerel, sizzled, their skins crisping to a bronze gold, filling the air with a smoky, salty fragrance that cut through all other smells. A few soldi changed hands, silent and swift. The fish was slipped onto a square of old parchment, its heat immediately warming the fingers. Finding a seat on the sun-warmed steps of a vera de pozzo, the ornamental wellhead in the square's centre, the craftsman began to eat. The flesh was flaky and moist, simply seasoned with nothing but sea salt and fire. The taste was profound in its purity, the essence of the lagoon. As the meal was consumed, the gaze drifted past the boat, past the church, to where the canal exited the campo under a low humpbacked bridge. There the water became a canvas for the sun. The light did not merely shine on it, it played within it. The surface was a restless, shimmering plain of liquid mercury, dappled with reflected brilliance from the white sky. Where the water met the ancient brick of a building's foundation, the light transformed. It fractured into 1,000 dancing coins of brilliance, a chaotic, ever-shifting mosaic of gold and white that rippled and pulsed with the water's gentle movement. The bricks themselves, worn smooth by centuries of tidal caress, glowed with a soft, roseate warmth, their every fissure and eroded hollow cast into sharp relief by the glancing light. This was not the fierce direct light of the Kale, nor the contained orange glow of the furnace. This was light mediated by water, softened, broken, and made playful. It was a spectacle that required no thought, only observation, a hypnotic ballet of reflection and movement that soothed the mind as the simple food nourished the body. Finishing the last of the fish, the parchment folded neatly, the craftsman remained on the warm stone. The slight ache in the muscles was a comfortable, earned thing. The fierce focus of the morning had dissolved, replaced by a pleasant, empty receptivity. The sounds of the campo, the murmur of scattered conversations, the cry of a child, the distant bell of another church marking the half-hour, washed over without demand. The waterlight continued its endless rippling dance on the ancient brick, a reminder that beauty existed here, not only in things made by hand, but in the effortless, transient interactions of element and time. The noon bell had not just signalled a pause for sustenance, it had opened a door to this other Venice, a city of public light and shared quiet, a necessary counterpoint to the private, shadowed, fiery world of the workshop. The heat of the sun soaked into the bones, different from the furnace's heat, a healing warmth that prepared the spirit as the annula's gentle heat prepared the glass for the slow, steady return to work that the afternoon would bring. Chapter 5. The Gift of Cobalt. The afternoon sun, having passed its zenith, now slanted through the high workshop windows in long lazy bars of gold, illuminating the swirling dust motes that danced like slow constellations in the still, warm air. The furnace muttered to itself in the background, banked but alive, a sleeping dragon's breath. The morning's fire dance was over, the shaped bowl resting in the annealing oven's gentle embrace. Now came a task of quiet alchemy, a preparation not of form, but of pure, unadulterated colour. On the scarred wooden bench, away from the direct heat, sat a small, linen-wrapped bundle. Unfolding the cloth revealed its treasure. 3 cakes of smolto, the precious coloured glass made for the specific purpose of being ground into pigment. They were not the brilliant rods used for canes, but dense, opaque ingots, each about the size of a palm. 2 were a deep royal blue, the third a shade lighter, like a summer sky at dusk. Cobalt, the most precious blue, the colour of deep water and distant mountains. The hue that would, tomorrow, be dusted onto a gather of clear glass, to transform it into a piece of celestial brilliance. The tools for this transformation were simple, ancient, and profound. A heavy stone mortar, its interior bowl, worn smooth and dark by generations of grinding, and its matching pestle, a stone cylinder whose weight was perfectly balanced in the hand. Lifting one of the darker cakes, it was cool and surprisingly heavy, a solid piece of concentrated sky. Placing it in the mortar's bowl, it sat there, an inert jewel. Then the pestle was raised and brought down with a firm, controlled tap. A sharp crack echoed in the quiet workshop, a clean, mineral sound. The cake fractured into a handful of smaller, irregular pieces, their edges catching the slanted light with a hard, vitreous glint. The true work began. The pestle was set into the bowl amongst the fragments, and with a firm, circular pressure, it was ground against the mortar's stone surface. The first pass produced a coarse, grating crunch, the sound of resistance being overcome. The blue glass shattered into smaller shards, then into coarse granules. The rhythm was established then, a slow clockwise rotation, the weight of the arm and shoulder, channeled through the smooth stone pestle. Crunch, grind, rotate, crunch, grind, rotate. It was a meditative, almost monastic sound, utterly different from the furnace's roar or the hiss of steam on wood. This was a sound of reduction, of patient breaking down. The coarse granules yielded further, becoming a gritty powder. The colour, which had been a solid opaque blue, began to change in character. As it fragmented, it seemed to release its essence. The powder in the mortar's bowl was no longer a flat blue, but a myriad of tiny, faceted particles, each one a minuscule prism catching the afternoon light. It sparkled, a crushed galaxy of deep azure and violet hints. The process required patience. Too much haste would create an uneven grind, leaving granules large enough to cause flaws in the finished piece. So the rhythm continued, steady and unhurried. The mind freed from the intense, split-second decisions of hot glass shaping could wander. The repetitive motion became a kind of trance, the sound of stone on stone, the feel of the pestle's smoothness, the visual transformation of solid to powder. It was a ritual of making the raw material obedient, of translating a chunk of coloured glass into a cloud of potential. The cobalt had been born in a different fire, in a specialist's furnace, where minerals and silica fused under precise conditions to lock this specific, costly hue into a stable form. Now, in this quieter corner of creation, it was being liberated, its chromatic power being readied for a new union. After what felt like both an instant and an age, the grinding produced a fine, silken powder. Lifting the pestle, the mortar's bowl held what looked like crushed lapis lazuli, but finer, more consistent. It was a profound velvety blue, so rich it seemed to absorb the light around it. Using a broad-bladed knife, the powder was carefully gathered and funneled into a waiting ceramic jar, its glaze a simple, creamy white. The jar was small, with a tight-fitting cork lid. The cobalt powder whispered as it flowed, a soft, hissing cascade. Filling the jar was an act of reverence. This was not merely pigment, it was condensed sky, purchased with a significant portion of a week's earnings to be used sparingly, thoughtfully. A single jar could last for months, its contents dusted onto countless pieces, each pinch carrying the memory of this afternoon's rhythmic labour. Sealing the jar, a stray wisp of powder remained on the stone bench. With a damp cloth, the craftsman began to wipe the mortar and pestle clean, the blue staining the cloth a vivid hue. Finally, the bench itself was wiped. But as the cloth passed over the wood, a thumb brushed against a nearly invisible smudge of the powder, left behind from handling the jar. Looking down, the sight was arresting. A single accidental streak of cobalt adorned the ball of the thumb. It was not a solid mark, but a faint, dusty bloom, the individual particles clinging to the skin's whorls and lines. Yet within that tiny smudged fingerprint, the colour held an impossible depth. It was not a surface blue, but a luminous, sinking blue, a blue that seemed to have volume and distance. In that minuscule, flawed application, the powder captured the very essence of the Veneto sky on a perfect autumn afternoon, the clear, infinite azure that arched over the lagoon, the deeper tones gathering at the horizon where sea met sky. It was a promise, a preview of the magic that would happen tomorrow when this powder met the white-hot gather, fusing into the glass, becoming not a surface coating, but the body of the piece itself, a vessel forever holding a fragment of that boundless sky. The craftsman stared at the thumb for a long moment, then with a slow, deliberate motion, brushed the powder away, leaving only a faint cerulean ghost in the skin's creases. The jar was placed on a high shelf, a treasure secured. The afternoon's quiet alchemy was complete, the gift of cobalt prepared, its potential now sleeping in white ceramic, waiting for the fire's kiss to wake it into everlasting blue. Chapter 6. The Evening Walk, Part 1. The heavy iron key turned in the workshop lock with a final satisfying clunk, a sound that severed the day's last formal tie to the realm of fire and transformation. The leather apron hung on its peg inside still radiated a faint, dry warmth. Stepping back onto the fondamenta, the craftsman paused, allowing the evening to announce itself. The light had changed utterly. The white, hammering glare of noon was gone, replaced by a soft, honeyed gold that poured sideways down the canal, stretching shadows into long, graceful fingers that reached across the water to touch the opposite wall. The city itself seemed to exhale, its daytime bustle softening into a gentler, more intimate murmur. Commerce was folding its tents. The frantic energy of trade and transport was ebbing with the light, leaving behind a Venice that belonged to its stones and its water. Instead of turning left, the familiar direct route home along the broader Rio, the feet chose a different path, a whim born of the day's lingering contentment. A narrow sottoportego, a covered passageway that burrowed through the ground floor of an ancient building, offered an alternative. Ducking into its cool, damp gloom was like entering a cave. The air was several degrees colder, smelling of wet brick and centuries of condensed breath. The sound of footsteps echoed sharply off the low vaulted ceiling before emerging, blinking, into a tiny courtyard on the other side. Here a single fig tree struggled from a crack in the paving, its broad leaves dark and still. A cat, the colour of ash, watched from a windowsill with indifferent yellow eyes before turning to wash a paw. This was the Venice of secrets and shortcuts, a city layered not just in height, but in hidden passages. The chosen route wound away from the main arteries, following a sequence of ever narrower calli that sometimes ended in small silent campielli, sometimes in a set of steps descending directly into the opaque green water of a blind canal. The sounds of the city transformed. The distant clatter of carts was gone. Now the dominant melody was the lap of water against stone steps, the occasional drift of a radio playing opera from an open upper window, the soft rhythmic scraping of a broom on stone as a shopkeeper swept his threshold for the night. A conversation in rapid-fire dialect floated down from a laundry-strung balcony, the words indistinct but the cadence musical. A private duet in the gathering dusk, passing under a particularly low, hump-backed bridge, the brickwork so close it brushed the shoulders. Another sound entered the symphony. From the watery darkness ahead came the clear, liquid dip, pause, swish of a single oar. A gondola, black as a slit in the water, glided into view. The gondolier stood silhouetted against the golden light at the far end of the canal, his body a study in efficient, rocking motion. He was not ferrying tourists, but seemed to be on his own journey home, the empty craft riding high. The sound of his oar in the forecola, the dip into the water, and the following swirl of the wake was crisp and solitary, an acoustic signature of the city that echoed off the close walls with a melancholic purity. It was the sound of isolation amidst intimacy, a man alone in his skill, navigating the liquid streets as the craftsman navigated the molten glass, both practitioners of arts that required solitude within the crowd. Emerging from the narrow canal onto the broader flank of a secondary Rio, the vista opened slightly. Here the buildings were grander, the facades showing the faded elegance of merchant palazzi. Their windows, tall and arched, most were shuttered, dark. But one, on the second floor of a building with water-stained pink plaster, held a light. The window was not of clear glass, but of thick, ancient vetro aghiaccio, the rough, greenish glass of centuries past, full of bubbles and imperfections. Behind it, a lamp had been lit. Its light did not shine out. It glowed within the thick, viscous pane, diffused and softened into a submarine radiance. It was the colour of sunlit seawater over pale sand, a luminous, mossy green gold that seemed to pulse gently in the twilight. The craftsman stopped, transfixed. That window was not merely illuminated, it was inhabited by its own atmosphere. The light spoke of a room within, a space enclosed and private. It hinted at a desk perhaps, or a reading chair, a book open under that gentle glow. It spoke of another person, in another quiet room, engaged in some other act of evening repose or solitary focus, an accountant over ledgers, a scholar over a text, a widow with her embroidery. It was a beacon not of spectacle, but of interiority. That soft greenish light, filtered through the imperfect glass, was a perfect metaphor. It was the light of other crafts, other quiet lives. Not the fierce orange-white light of the furnace that laid everything bare, but this gentle, diffuse glow that concealed as much as it revealed, that spoke of patience, of thought, of things worked slowly in the mind or with delicate tools. It was a reminder that the city's heart beat not only in the forges of the glassworks or the bustle of the Rialto, but in 1,000 such rooms, where different kinds of mastery were practiced. Different kinds of beauty were considered, all behind windows of imperfect green glass that turned private light into a public, watery jewel. A deep sense of kinship, wordless and warm, flowed through the observer. The day's work, the physical grapple with heat and gravity, the approval of the maestro, the grinding of cobalt, was part of a vast silent tapestry. That glowing window was another thread. The gondolier's solitary oarstroke was another. The city, in this softening hour, revealed itself not as a museum or a postcard, but as a living organism, composed of countless such small, dedicated pulses. The craftsman stood for a long moment, the fatigue in the shoulders feeling earned and honourable, the calm in the spirit feeling connected. The green gold light in the palazzo window seemed to acknowledge this without judgment, a silent nod from one quiet life to another across the darkening canal. Then with a final glance the craftsman turned, leaving the Rio behind, moving deeper into the labyrinth, carrying the image of that underwater radiance like a talisman, a reminder that the world was full of fires banked to a gentler, more enduring glow. Chapter 6. The Evening Walk, Part 2. The final turn into the home canal was less a conscious decision and more a gravitational pull, the body knowing the path as surely as water knows its bed. The narrow Rio was a familiar embrace, its walls of ochre and rose plaster leaning close, their surfaces textured by crumbling sgraffito and the ghostly outlines of vanished frescoes. The sky above the watery slit had deepened to a profound violet, a colour that seemed to vibrate with the day's last light, as if the very air was stained by the memory of the cobalt powder. The modest door, set just above the waterline and framed by blocks of white Istrian stone, worn smooth by tides and touch, was a sight that unknotted the last tight cord of the day's focus. It was not just a door, it was a threshold between the world of making and the world of being, and crossing it was a kind of gentle collapse. The key, smaller and smoother than the workshop's iron beast, slid into the lock with a soft click. The door swung inward, revealing the cool, shadowed interior of the ground floor room. The simple bed, the small table, the terrazzo floor that would feel like a balm to tired feet. But entry was delayed by a final, anchoring ritual. Turning back, the craftsman leaned against the stone door jamb, letting the solid coolness seep through the thin fabric of the tunic. The body presented its own quiet report. A deep, dull ache resided in the shoulders, a satisfying burn that spoke of hours supporting the turning weight of iron and molten glass. It was not a pain of injury, but a narrative of effort, a topographic map of the day's labour etched into the muscles. In the fingers, held loosely at the sides, there was a calm fatigue, a slight tremor that was the residue of constant, minute adjustments, the grip on the blowpipe, the pressure of the wooden blocks, the delicate touch to the coloured cane. They felt empty now, and light, their purpose fulfilled. The gaze drifted past the fondamenta's edge to the water of the Rio. In the hours since the walk began, it had undergone its own transformation. No longer the greenish, sun-dappled medium of the afternoon, it had become an ink-dark plain, a sheet of obsidian, so still it seemed a solid surface. Then, a slight swell from some distant passage of a boat would make it shiver, and the illusion would break, revealing its liquid depth. It was into this black mirror that the first stars introduced themselves. Not the crowded brilliance of a country sky, but a few brave pinpoints pricking through the violet veil above the rooftops. One, then two, then a handful. Their reflections were not perfect dots, but delicate, trembling stitches of silver light, drawn out into brief, shimmering lines by the water's almost imperceptible movement. They were cold, clean, and infinitely distant, a silent counterpoint to the remembered, earth-born fire of the furnace. A deep, slow breath was drawn in, filling the lungs with the cooling evening air. It carried a complex bouquet, the ever-present damp stone and saline bass note, the faint, oily scent of lamp smoke from a neighbouring window, the rich, loamy smell of wet wood from the mooring posts, and then, threading through it all, a sudden startling sweetness. It was the perfume of night-blooming flowers, likely jasmine, or perhaps gelsomino, escaping from some hidden courtyard garden or a pot on a high balcony. It was a scent that belonged entirely to the night, fragile and intoxicating, a gift offered only when the sun was gone and the city quieted. It spoke of secrets and rest, of beauty that unfolds unseen for its own sake. This moment, poised on the threshold, contained the entire day in miniature. The ache was the fire's heart and the maestro's nod. The star-reflecting water was the cobalt sky held in a jar and the green-gold light in the palazzo window. The sweet, cool air was the respite of the noon bell and the silent companionship of the wandering walk. It was a full circle, a completed cycle. There was no grand triumph, only the simple, unassailable satisfaction of a day spent in honest dialogue with material and tradition. The bowl in the annealing oven, the jar of blue powder on the shelf, these were testaments, but the deeper testament was in the weary body and the calm spirit. With a final long exhalation that seemed to release the last vestiges of furnace heat and focused intensity, the craftsman pushed away from the door jamb. The stars trembled on the black water, the sweet scent lingered, The modest room beckoned with its simple comforts: a glass of water, a wash basin, the waiting bed. The door was pulled closed, the lock engaged from within, shutting out the violet sky and the ink-dark canal. The day, with all its fire and colour, its scrutiny and solitude, was now a memory held in the bones and the quieting mind. Outside, Venice continued its slow, liquid breath under the emerging stars, and inside, in the cool, dark room, the maker of glass prepared for the silent, necessary work of sleep, where the hands finally stilled and the fire of creation banked itself to dream. We have reached the end of this video's narrative section. What follows is a gentle transition into soothing auditory ambience, aimed at putting you to sleep for good. I hope you have already drifted off into a deep slumber by this point, but if you have not, do not worry. Put your mind at ease, relax your body, and take a few deep breaths. There is nothing left to do. You have reached the end of your day. Have a good night, and may you sleep well.